For millions of viewers, Sara Gilbert will always be remembered as the sharp-witted, intelligent presence who grew up right in front of America's eyes. From her early days on television to becoming one of the most recognizable faces of a generation, her rise felt natural, steady, and almost effortless. She wasn't just a child star. She was someone audiences trusted, related to, and watched mature over the years. Fame didn't appear to swallow her whole, and many assumed her life behind the scenes must be just as stable as the characters she portrayed. But the truth about how Sara Gilbert lives today tells a far more complicated story. One filled with quiet struggles, difficult choices, and emotional sacrifices that rarely make headlines. While the world moved on, celebrating new stars and new stories, Sara's journey took a path few expected. Success came with a cost, and over time, the pressures of early fame, public expectations, and deeply personal decisions began shaping a life far removed from the image people still hold on to. Now at 50, Sara's life looks nothing like the future many imagined for her. The spotlight faded, personal priorities shifted, and the reality of navigating adulthood after growing up on camera brought challenges that are rarely discussed openly. What happened behind the scenes reveals a story not of failure, but of endurance, one that forces us to rethink what success truly looks like when fame arrives too early and never fully lets go. Sara Gilbert's journey began in a way most people only dream about. She entered the entertainment world at a remarkably young age, displaying a level of intelligence and emotional depth that instantly set her apart from other child performers. While many young actors were cast for charm alone, Sara stood out because she brought authenticity, wit, and realism to her roles. Audiences didn't just watch her, they believed her. From early on, it was clear she wasn't simply acting. She was observing the world and reflecting it back with honesty far beyond her years. Growing up in front of the camera shaped nearly every aspect of her life. While other children were navigating school hallways anonymously, Sara was learning lines, attending sets, and absorbing the pressures of public visibility. Success came early, but so did expectations. She was praised for being different, smarter, and more grounded than her peers. Labels that quietly placed a heavy burden on her shoulders. Being perceived as mature at such a young age meant there was little room to stumble, experiment, or simply be uncertain. Things that are essential parts of growing up. As her career progressed, Sara made choices that reflected her desire for control rather than constant visibility. She pursued education seriously, stepping away at times when many expected her to capitalize endlessly on fame. To the outside world, this appeared admirable and disciplined. But beneath the surface, it also hinted at something deeper, a need for balance, distance, and perhaps protection from an industry that rarely slows down for anyone, especially those who start young. Fame had given her opportunities, but it also demanded parts of her identity in return. Transitioning from child star to adult performer is notoriously difficult, and Sara's experience was no exception. While she continued to work steadily, the roles changed, the audience shifted, and the spotlight became less forgiving. The industry that once celebrated her uniqueness now measured success differently. Visibility mattered more than substance, and longevity required constant reinvention. For someone who valued privacy, intellect, and authenticity, this environment could feel increasingly uncomfortable. What many didn't see was the emotional weight of being permanently associated with a past version of oneself. No matter how much Sara evolved, the public often froze her in time, measuring her present against memories of who she used to be. This kind of comparison can quietly erode confidence, creating an internal conflict between personal growth and public perception. Living under that shadow makes it difficult to feel fully seen as who you are now, rather than who people remember. Behind the scenes, Sara's life became more focused on stability than spectacle. She explored roles beyond acting, moving into creative and production spaces where control and intention mattered more than applause. While these choices reflected maturity and self-awareness, they also placed her further from the spotlight that once defined her. For audiences who equate success with constant visibility, this shift was often misunderstood as fading relevance rather than deliberate evolution. Personal life choices also shaped her path in ways that were deeply human and quietly challenging. Balancing career demands with relationships, family responsibilities, and self-identity required compromises that never made headlines. Unlike many public figures who build brands around reinvention, Sara seemed to move inward instead, choosing substance over attention, privacy over performance. That decision came with peace, but also with a sense of invisibility that can feel heavy after years of being recognized everywhere you go. Now, looking at Sara Gilbert at 50, the sadness people perceive is not rooted in loss or failure, but in contrast. It's the contrast between who the world expected her to become and the quieter life she chose instead. It's the realization that early success does not guarantee lifelong fulfillment, and that growing up in the public eye often leaves emotional gaps that take decades to understand. Her story is not about falling from fame, but about stepping away from it and the emotional cost that choice can carry. What makes her journey resonate is its honesty. Sara's life reflects a truth many former child stars face but rarely articulate, that surviving fame can be harder than achieving it. The challenges she encountered were subtle, cumulative, and deeply personal. They didn't explode into scandal or spectacle. They unfolded quietly, shaping a life that feels heavier than people expected. Not because it lacked success, but because it demanded constant self-negotiation. Her story invites us to reconsider what sad really means. Is it the absence of attention or the presence of unresolved weight? Is it stepping out of the spotlight or carrying the memory of it forever? In Sara Gilbert's case, the sadness lies not in where she is now, but in everything she had to navigate to get there. Unseen, uncelebrated, and often misunderstood. As Sara Gilbert moved further into adulthood, the question of identity became impossible to ignore. Growing up in the public eye often leaves little room for self-discovery, and for Sara, this challenge unfolded gradually but deeply. The person the audience thought they knew was shaped by scripted roles, edited interviews, and decades-old impressions. Meanwhile, the real individual behind those images was evolving in ways that didn't always align with public expectations. This quiet disconnect created a lifelong tension between who she was becoming and who the world expected her to remain. One of the most difficult aspects of her journey was learning how to exist outside constant validation. Fame introduces applause early, but it also teaches dependence on external approval. When that attention fades, the silence can feel unsettling. Sara's life required her to redefine worth without the reassurance of widespread recognition. That process is rarely visible and often emotionally draining. It involves confronting insecurities that were postponed during childhood, when survival meant performance rather than introspection. Personal sacrifices also played a significant role in shaping her present life. Relationships, routines, and emotional availability were often influenced by the unpredictable demands of her career. Even when she stepped back from acting, the residual effects of growing up under scrutiny remained. Trust became selective, privacy became essential, and emotional boundaries were carefully constructed. These were not walls built out of fear, but protections developed through experience. Over time, however, such boundaries can also create distance, making genuine connection harder to sustain. Sara's approach to life began to reflect a deep need for stability rather than recognition. She chose consistency over excitement, introspection over reinvention. While these choices provided grounding, they also positioned her outside the narratives that Hollywood celebrates. The industry often rewards visibility, transformation, and spectacle, while quieter forms of growth go unnoticed. For someone like Sara, whose evolution was inward and deliberate, this meant existing in a space that felt increasingly invisible to the public eye. There was also the challenge of reconciling past success with present reality. Being associated with a defining role can feel both comforting and limiting. On one hand, it offers lifelong recognition. On the other, it anchors identity to a specific moment in time. For Sara, this meant carrying the weight of nostalgia, a reminder of what once was, and a silent comparison to what came after. Living with that contrast can quietly erode self-confidence, especially when public discourse frames growth as decline rather than change. Emotional fatigue is another element often overlooked in stories like hers. Years of navigating expectations, assumptions, and projections can leave lasting effects. Even without active criticism, the awareness of being observed shapes behavior and self-perception. Over time, this awareness can dull spontaneity and increase self-monitoring. For Sara, adulthood became a period of recalibration, learning how to exist without constantly anticipating how others might interpret her. Choices. Family and personal responsibilities also added layers of complexity to her life. Balancing proof. Nostalgia is a double-edged force for former child stars. On one side, it preserves admiration and affection. On the other, it traps individuals in a past version of themselves. For Sara, nostalgia became a constant presence, influencing how audiences measured her present life. Comparisons to her younger self were unavoidable, often framing her current choices as absence rather than evolution. This lens rarely allows room for complexity, growth, or personal redefinition, and it can leave individuals feeling invisible even while being recognized. Emotional isolation is a frequent, but rarely discussed consequence of long-term visibility. Growing up in front of millions means learning early how to perform composure, even during moments of uncertainty. Over time, this performance can become second nature, making it difficult to express vulnerability authentically. For Sara, adulthood brought an awareness of how deeply ingrained this habit had become. Sharing emotions selectively, maintaining boundaries, and guarding inner thoughts were survival mechanisms that once protected her. But they also contributed to a sense of emotional distance. The public's interpretation of her quieter life often misses this nuance. Reduced visibility is frequently mistaken for disengagement or loss, when in reality it may reflect intention. Sara's decision to prioritize personal well-being over constant exposure challenged traditional ideas of success. However, the absence of spectacle allowed assumptions to fill the void. In a culture that equates relevance with visibility, choosing a private path can unintentionally invite narratives of sadness, decline, or regret. Media narratives also played a role in shaping how her present life is perceived. Headlines tend to simplify complex journeys, focusing on contrasts rather than continuity. For Sara, this meant being framed through what she was no longer doing instead of what she had intentionally chosen. Such framing overlooks the emotional work involved in redefining purpose beyond fame. It reduces a nuanced life to a comparison, reinforcing the idea that fulfillment must mirror past success to be considered valid. Another overlooked aspect is the quiet grief associated with leaving a defining behind. Even when the departure is voluntary, it can still carry emotional weight. Letting go of a role that shaped identity, routine, and connection to an audience is not simple. For Sara, this transition involved acknowledging both gratitude and loss, appreciating what her early career gave her, while accepting that it no longer defined who she was. This internal negotiation is rarely visible but deeply impactful. Social expectations further complicate this experience. Former stars are often expected to either reinvent dramatically or remain frozen in nostalgia. There is little room for normalcy, stability, or quiet fulfillment. Sara's life defies these extremes, existing in a space that is neither sensational nor tragic. Yet this very normalcy can be misinterpreted as sadness simply because it lacks the dramatic markers people associate with public success. Emotional resilience becomes essential in navigating this space. Sara's ability to maintain composure, privacy, and self-respect speaks to a strength that is often overlooked. While the public may perceive distance, the reality is that such distance can be a form of self-preservation. Choosing not to perform one's personal life is an assertion of autonomy, especially for someone whose childhood was defined by constant observation. At 50. Sara Gilbert's life reflects the long-term impact of early fame and the complex process of reclaiming identity beyond it. The sadness people project onto her story says as much about cultural expectations as it does about her reality. Her journey highlights how easily society equates quietness with emptiness and visibility with value. In truth, her life demonstrates the courage required to step away from external validation and redefine success on one's own terms. This part of her story invites empathy rather than judgment. It challenges us to consider how public narratives can distort understanding and how nostalgia can prevent us from seeing people as they are now. Sara's experience is not one of disappearance, but of transition, a gradual shift toward a life shaped by intention rather than applause. The emotional weight she carries is not a sign of failure, but evidence of growth forged under extraordinary circumstances. At 50. Sara Gilbert's life stands as a quiet counter-narrative to how success is usually measured. While the world often equates happiness with visibility and momentum, her journey suggests something far more complicated and human. The sadness people sense when they look at her life today does not come from failure or loss of purpose, but from the emotional weight of having lived too much of life too early. Growing up under constant attention shapes a person in ways that take decades to fully understand. And adulthood often becomes a time of repair rather than expansion. For Sara, moving forward meant redefining fulfillment on her own terms. That process required letting go of public expectations that no longer served her well-being. The applause faded, but so did the constant pressure to perform. In its place came stability, routine, and privacy. Things that might seem ordinary, yet feel profoundly earned to someone who spent their formative years being watched, evaluated, and remembered. This transition, while healthy, also came with a sense of emotional quiet that outsiders often misinterpret as emptiness. There is also a subtle grief in realizing that parts of life were never fully lived in real time. Childhood experiences filtered through schedules, scripts, and scrutiny leave gaps that cannot easily be revisited. Adulthood then carries the responsibility of making sense of those gaps. Sara's present life reflects that work, the internal processing, the boundary setting, and the conscious decision to move at a pace that allows for emotional safety rather than constant achievement. That kind of life rarely looks impressive from the outside, but it can be deeply necessary. Her story also highlights how difficult it is to outgrow public memory. For many, Sara will always be the person they remember from decades ago, regardless of how much she has evolved. This fixed image creates a permanent comparison that few people are ever asked to endure. Living under that comparison can quietly shape self-perception, making it harder to feel complete in the present. The sadness viewers project onto her life may actually reflect the discomfort of seeing someone choose normalcy over nostalgia. Yet, within this quieter life exists a form of resilience that deserves recognition. Choosing privacy after public success is not retreat, it is self-preservation. Sara's ability to step away from constant validation, to accept reduced visibility without chasing relevance, shows emotional strength developed through experience rather than ambition. She survived an environment that consumes many, and in doing so, she claimed ownership over her time, identity, and emotional boundaries. What makes her story resonate is not tragedy, but truth. It exposes the long-term consequences of early fame and challenges the idea that success must be loud to be meaningful. Sara Gilbert's life today is not defined by loss, but by adjustment. It reflects the reality that some journeys are about slowing down, healing, and learning how to exist without performing for an audience. That process can look somber, especially when contrasted with the brightness of youth. But it is often where real peace begins. The sadness attached to her story is less about her circumstances and more about the expectations placed upon her. Society struggles to accept that stepping away can be a form of growth. When a public figure chooses inward stability over outward success, the narrative often becomes one of decline rather than transformation. Sara's life challenges that framing, reminding us that fulfillment does not always look like progression. Sometimes it looks like rest. In the end, her story invites empathy rather than judgment. It asks us to reconsider how we define happiness, success, and purpose, especially for those who grow up too fast in environments that demand more than they give back. Sara Gilbert's life at 50 is not a cautionary tale, but a human one shaped by early achievement, emotional recalibration, and the courage to live without constant approval. Her journey may feel sad to those who expected more spectacle, but it is deeply relatable to anyone who has had to rebuild themselves after living someone else's expectations for too long. And perhaps that is the most powerful part of her story, not that she stepped out of the spotlight, but that she learned how to live without needing it.